where we have a guest speaker today, Dr. Scott Stroud. Dr. Scott Stroud is going to talk about Ambedkar's Buddhism and Ambedkar's Pragmatism. So before we start, I would like to just give small introduction of Dr. Scott. Dr. Scott is an associate professor of communications studies at the University of Texas in Austin. He writes on various topics in ethics, rhetoric, and philosophy. He has authored 3 books, academic books, John Dewey and the Artful Life, Kant and the Promise of Rhetoric, and the forthcoming work, The Evolution of Pragmatism in Indian, Ambedkar, Dewey, and the Rhetoric of Reconstruction. He's the co-founder of the first Center for John Dewey Studies in India at Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Thank you very much, Dr. Scout, for joining us today. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Pradeep, and thank you at the Ambedkar Association of North America for having me on here. And Jai Bhim, Namo Buddhaya for everyone watching. Sometimes I'm boring, so I've got some pretty pictures of Babasaheb and Babasaheb's own text that I've been collecting in my research. So I'll show some slides to make things as understandable and entertaining as I can. So hopefully you can see my slides. Is that correct, Pradeep? Oh, sorry. Let's see.
We cannot see the slides yet.
Yes, I have to hit the share button. All right. Now you should see the shot of the slide.
Yeah, we can see.
You'll see this book in a second, but this is actually one of Ambedkar's copies of John Dewey's book, Democracy and Education, and these are Babasaheb's underlinings. And so I have, as you will get through this presentation, I've fallen in love with Babasaheb's thought. I've fallen in love with his connection to American pragmatism. This is the school of philosophy I was, I've been studying before I got into Babasaheb's thought, and his Buddhism has just become incredibly fascinating for me. So let me talk to you all for about 30, 40 minutes, Ambedkar's Buddhism and Ambedkar's pragmatism. Now, I've been infatuated with Ambedkar's connection to pragmatism since I first read these lines. In 1952, he supposedly wrote I've seen the letter, he's written to his wife Savita, and he, upon learning about John Dewey's death, and he says, "Oh well, I was looking so forward to meeting him on his trip back to Columbia to get his honorary doctorate. I owe my whole life to him, my whole intellectual life to him." And this is fascinating. Everyone notices this about Ambedkar. Every biography includes this line, but no one, to my satisfaction, has really unpacked it. What's his relationship to this American tradition of thought called pragmatism? Okay. You also might have read something about this in The Annihilation of Caste, that wonderful and powerful manifesto he writes in 1936. Here is one of his few explicit references to John Dewey. And he quotes Dewey and he says, "John Dewey, who was my teacher and to whom I owe so much." So all of this has got me thinking more and more about, a variety of questions. But in the most general form, it's these. And these are the ones that will kind of focus what I talk to you all about today in the online Vihara. One is, what is, Ambedkar's relationship to John Dewey? And Dewey is a pragmatist, so what's Ambedkar's relationship to pragmatism? And then the other question, which is just become, is fascinating me more with every day, which is, what does Ambedkar's pragmatism look like? And how is it related to his Buddhism? I firmly believe that his Buddhism in the 1950s is the developed form of his pragmatism. Now, a lot of people hear me talk about Ambedkar as a pragmatist, and they hear he is the same thing as John Dewey. Get that thought out of your mind. I mean, pragmatism is one of these traditions where people take parts of it and do new things or change something, and it's a many-headed beast, so to speak. So you'll see in a second that Ambedkar's pragmatism is something absolutely new. It's not like the pragmatism of Dewey. It's not exactly like the pragmatism of James or Peirce. Okay, it's something new. So this has sent me to India about 5 or 6 times. I've tried to meet everyone that I can that has scraps of paper that Babasaheb wrote, or collections of his books, or knowledge of the Ambedkarite movement. I met the politicians like Dr. Nitin Raut, Mankar, Anandraj Ambedkar, Mr. Bimrao Ambedkar. I've met a variety of people connected to his legacy, and it's just been so elucidating to me. On how the Dalit struggle has evolved and the challenges it continues to face. And along the way, of course, I have tried to get my hands on every bit of archival information that gets me a little bit further into the mind of Dr. Ambedkar. We have all of his writings, but the question is, what lies behind these? What was he thinking? How did he develop this line of thought? So that's kind of what drives me. And this is coming out in January of 2023 in a book called The Evolution of Pragmatism in India, Ambedkar, Dewey, and the Rhetoric of Reconstruction. You'll get part of that story here today, but a lot more of this will be in the book. And Chicago is working with an Indian publisher to get an Indian edition later in spring 2023. So hopefully everyone will be able to read this and see if they like what I'm thinking or what I not like what I'm thinking. Now, some of you may wonder, what is pragmatism? Right, because this is a question, pragmatism is a school of American thought that starts after the American Civil War. And it has some major figures, not the only figures, like Charles Peirce, William James, John Dewey, Jane Addams. These are some of the major figures who are academics, who are activists, that are working in this tradition of pragmatism. It also has international folks like Husserl, a student of John Dewey's, who in my book, I give the evidence that he was actually in the class that Ambedkar took in 1516 with Dewey. And Husserl goes back to China and kind of does something there very unique with some of the stuff he saw as inspirational in John Dewey. So there's all these different kinds of pragmatist stories that are being told, but no one has ever told the story of pragmatism in India. What gets changed, what gets resisted, what lines of influence are there? And so I kind of took it on myself with the great respect I have for pragmatism, the great respect I have for the wonderfully long tradition of thought in India, to try to tell that story that focuses in on Babasaheb and John Dewey. So here are two pictures jammed together of Dewey and Ambedkar. We have no pictures of them actually in the same shot. But this is the question, how do these two thinkers relate? Now, the challenge is, and I'm always skeptical when someone says, Ambedkar isn't like Dewey. And then they say something. Well, they say Ambedkar is just like Dewey. Dewey wrote 38 volumes. That's his collected works in the colorful edition there. And that's over 8 million words. Ambedkar's English writings that have been translated into English are the ones you see at the bottom of this slide. And that's, millions of words as well. So there's a real shorthand that goes on when you say, I'm holding Ambedkar up next to Dewey, and they're the same, or they're totally different. Or Ambedkar goes beyond Dewey. Like Dewey's one thing, and Ambedkar's gone beyond it. These are all incredibly simplistic ways of parsing the situation. And I think in many cases, they're not useful. Why? Because Ambedkar did not read all those volumes from Dewey. Ambedkar had a certain image of John Dewey. It was an eclectic image. He read this book here. He heard this lecture there. And he used different parts of it. So I have been pushing scholars that I chat with to try to be very precise. What do we know Ambedkar had access to? What did we know inspired him or annoyed him about John Dewey's philosophy? So always keep in mind, Dewey and Ambedkar are complex thinkers. Now, back to that question. What's the relationship of Bhimrao Ambedkar? The story has to go back to Columbia University, which we all know was one of the places that Babasaheb studied. Well, it was here that he met John Dewey. Okay, and so the questions that'll drive this kind of aspect of the inquiry are these: like, what do we know Ambedkar heard or learned from John Dewey? And then, what did he add to that? What did he ignore? What did he use? What did he kind of extend in a different way? These are, the questions that we can use profitably to engage his time at Columbia. So looking at the Columbia, bulletins, which list all the courses that were taught, and looking at Babasaheb's transcripts, which you can find at Symbiosis University, you can find it at the Karmode papers in Mumbai, but you take his transcript and you can correlate what courses were taught by John Dewey. And so I figured out that there are 3 that were taught by John Dewey. One was a Philosophy 231 course called Psychological Ethics. And that was supposed to be followed by Philosophy 232. Ambedkar did not take 232. Why? Well, it's not listed on his transcript, and it's the same time period as a class by Vladimir Simkovich, a socialist who hated Marxism. So Ambedkar took that class instead. I have, ideas on why he maybe just took half of that psychology class. But in 1915, 1916, he took the whole year series of 2 courses of Philosophy 131, 132. This is a rare instance where Dewey goes through moral and political philosophy and the philosophy of law really. So, this is what he took from Dewey at Columbia. Notice there's no evidence that we have that he took Dewey's education class. Okay. He probably got Dewey's thought on education from the Democracy in Education book. And we know he bought that because he signed it January 6, 1917, London. He bought that in London. So if you care to be a little more precise, we can start to see when he got access to this part of Dewey, when he got access to that part, versus just the general stories we have he learned from Dewey at Columbia. Now I want to structure my talk in 3 kind of moves. If we want to, I call Ambedkar's pragmatism, I want to say it's something new. So I adopt the idiom of Navayana, new vehicle. So, he has a new form of Buddhism that other Buddhists will like or be inspired by, or in some cases push against. Same for his pragmatism. His pragmatism is different from the thought of Husserl in China. It's different from William James in Boston. It's different from John Dewey, his former teacher in New York. So I call it Navayana pragmatism. Okay. So what's different about his Navayana pragmatism? Well, here are 3 main commitments to it, as far as I could figure out. 1, Ambedkar is committed to the idea that caste is a habit or an attitude of mind. 2, that force is both needed and dangerous. And I'm going to explain each of these in turn. And then 3, this is fascinating because it's not something that Dewey particularly thought in the last 40 or 50 years of his life. Religion is a major means or method for ameliorating experience, for making things better. So let's go through each of these in turn. 1, caste as habit. In that Philosophy 231 class, I've gone and dug in the Dewey archives, and I've been able to find a variety of materials. My book will go through a lot of these, but I found like lecture notes, for instance, from John Dewey that he was using to extemporize to that class that Ambedkar was sitting in. And so I've been able to construct a story that's very specific. I mean, this is something that's always kind of intrigued me. Everyone talks about Ambedkar's education, but we have very little access to what he heard in the education. Okay, so getting things like lecture notes, you can know what he heard on this Monday for 50 minutes. So that gives us a whole new realm of possibilities. So for instance, you look at what Dewey actually told this class, and you start to see the specific psychology he was teaching at the time. Most other scholars, right, will look at some book Dewey wrote at that time and said, this must have been, I guess, what he was teaching. So I know for a fact what he was telling his class. So you start to see that Ambedkar was hearing this Deweyan story about psychology and ethics are integrally related. Knowing about the human mind teaches you about what you should do in terms of making society a better place, or how bad actions actually function. So intelligence is key. You also have the idea of attitude and habit being absolutely integral. The idea of, our mental frameworks we take to the world and our encounters with other people is absolutely key. And then you start to see Ambedkar use this in a way that Dewey never would have anticipated. You see no mention of caste in this class. Dewey does not make this a theme of his ethics, obviously, probably because Dewey, he's not oppressed by caste. It's not something that's on his radar, so to speak. But Ambedkar is obviously highly attuned to caste. So in the 1936 Annihilation of Caste, you see Ambedkar make what to many of our eyes looks like a strange move. Instead of talking about caste as systemic or structural, as modern people would talk about it, he talks about it in the language of Deweyan psychology. Caste is a notion, it's a state of mind. And reform is not the destruction of something physical, it's a notional change. It's a mental change. And you also see another part of Annihilation of Caste. He takes on the caste label specifically, and he says, all reform consists in a change in the notions, sentiments, and mental attitudes of the people towards men and things. And he says there's a common experience that names become associated with certain notions and sentiments, Kshatriya, Brahmin, etc. So what he's getting at here is fascinating to me. Is his pragmatism is taking seriously this kind of Deweyan approach to psychology, that things like names represent concepts that incline us to react in certain ways, and he's applying this to explain what's so pernicious about the caste system. Not that there are overt enforced customs, but the most troublesome thing is that The Varna and Avarna people, for instance, have in their minds this kind of way of looking at the world. I shouldn't touch that person, or I am untouchable. So this is part of Ambedkar's story about caste and the mental slavery it entails. He also hears in that psychology class a key point in Dewey, which is that reflective thought is absolutely crucial. We have no touchstones like the Sanatan tradition in Hinduism would give, Sanskrit folks. Okay. So Ambedkar and Dewey both give up on the idea that you can find a timeless principle with which you can, criticize things as bad or good. The best you can get, Dewey says, is reflective thinking. The idea that you sense crises and problems, and then you address them and hopefully then leave them behind. So in The Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar explicitly refers to reflective thought. And he says this only arises in a situation which presents a dilemma, a crisis, whereas Dewey would call it a problematic situation. Okay. A lot of us academics think that the whole experience of life is high-level thought and theories and this and that. But the pragmatists are, bracingly refreshing, at least on my read, because they say most of life isn't high-level thought. And that's probably good. It's good to just hit a 90-mile-per-hour fastball without thinking of theories of hitting. It's good to just talk with people without having to translate English into English, or you don't have to think about language when you use it immediately. So Ambedkar imbibes this kind of spirit of pragmatism, and he's attuned to the moments that present a crisis. That's when high-level thought is called for. And if you think about it, that's what he's trying to do with Annihilation of Caste. He's trying to jar the Mandal members in front of him into thinking caste is actually a crisis, not just a small problem that can be solved in easy ways. So, this kind of psychology influences the ways that Ambedkar engages caste. The moral and political philosophy course also was highly influential for Ambedkar. As I mentioned before, Hu Shi, the Chinese reformer, was in this class, and he takes very important lessons about force and nonviolence from it and goes back to China and engages the Chinese chaotic situation in different ways because of what he heard in Dewey. Ambedkar was very influenced by this same class. Okay, now I've found the notes for this class. Again, the question you can ask is, how do we know what Ambedkar heard in some class? Well, I find the notes, and on like 4 days of those notes, you see the picture here. A couple of those days, the regular note taker was sick, and students picked up the slack. One of those students on 4 days was Ambedkar. So you have, incontrovertible proof that this is a record of what Ambedkar was hearing. Now, like I said in my book, I go through a lot of this in a lot more detail, but here I want to bring up two things. One, this is where Ambedkar hears this kind of distinction about force as energy, force as violence. And this is also the class, I would argue, that we have evidence that Ambedkar heard the famous slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity. He hears this in April 1916. Now, he may have read it somewhere else, but we don't have evidence of that. But I have evidence that Dewey uttered these three things to Ambedkar and his classmates in April of 1916. So those three things, of course, if you know Babasaheb, they're incredibly important for him. They become something for him that they never were for Dewey. Dewey rarely uses these three values, but Ambedkar sees the value of these three. They're not criteria that come from the heavens, but they're useful criteria. So, so he uses them in a pragmatist way that the pragmatist teacher, John Dewey, never used them. Okay, and you, of course, have seen these in the preamble to the Constitution of India. You've seen these in the Buddha and his Dhamma. Okay, and you've seen them in his speeches, like the famous November 25th, 1949 one, where he talks about social democracy as a way of life that recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity in a balance, not one's more important than the others. So let's stop for a second and we can kind of think, if we were to ask, what's his Navayana pragmatism about? Well, it's integrally connected to this idea of social democracy. And what's that about? Well, it's about achieving a balance among liberty, equality, and fraternity, not just achieving equality. Okay, so justice is a balance of those three things. You can't sacrifice one or two and get justice. It also concerns individuals, habits, right? Because caste is a state of mind which individuals have and groups may share. Okay, and it also necessitates reflective individuals. Whatever state of mind you might pick up after caste is eradicated might also have its problems. So be attentive to problems and try to find ways to make the world better. So let's go to theme 2, force and reform. In 1918, Ambedkar goes back to India and authors a very short book review, effectively, in an economics journal based in India. And this book review is of a British philosopher that many folks in India probably didn't care much about, Bertrand Russell. So this always has interested me. Other scholars kind of brush over this. Maybe they're right, but to me, it's always weird. It's the only book review he's ever done. And a book review means you're focused intently on the thought of someone else. Ambedkar had a lot of things to say, so often he was focused on his own thought. So this is an interesting situation. Why did he review a book by Bertrand Russell? The Bertrand Russell book had nothing to do with India. It was about World War I. Russell was an extreme pacifist who got thrown in jail a variety of times, always in trouble. He was always opposed to the use of force. World War I, World War II, even Vietnam War. So, this has always intrigued me. Why does he focus on a book that doesn't seem to speak anything to the Indian people? So he look at the book though. It's fascinating. It's not just about World War I. It's about the use of force to get what you think is a just state of affairs. So in this book, Bertrand Russell, I give you a passage from it. He kind of analyzes it like this. Each side, and he's talking here about the British who say the Germans are evil and the Germans who say the British are evil, and then they go to war and kill a bunch of their young soldiers over these causes. They think each side believes it deserves to triumph. But when the oppressed win freedom, they are as oppressive as their former masters. So he gives almost a Hegelian reading here that, the oppressed win, or the people who think an injustice has been committed against them, and they win, and they're probably going to be as bad as the people who they were fighting against in some way. And in some ways, you can think about this. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I created problems for China, for Germany, and set the stage for World War II's violence. And so maybe Bertrand Russell was onto something. But in any case, Ambedkar sees this book as a fascinating reading about the challenges that await anyone who's going to make the world better. You might make it worse. So how, of course, Ambedkar doesn't want to give up on this. So in the book review, Ambedkar appreciates the book. He praises it, but he says, look, there's the chance that someone could misread what Russell is up to and think of Russell as just talking about passivity or quietism, giving up. And instead he says, Ambedkar says, let's look at Professor Dewey. And this is his first reference I've been able to find in all of his writings, is the first one to John Dewey, his teacher. He just got through with, a year or so ago before he came back from London. And, he refers to Dewey's distinction of force as violence or force as energy. And he says, look, you always need force for reform. Don't ever think that to get away from injustice, you just give up force. But instead, you want to give up violence, okay? Give up force as violence, not force as energy. Now, if we look back at those notes, here's what Dewey told him in April of 1916, told Ambedkar, Husher, and the rest of his class. He says something like this: in the case of force, which is a means, you have words which make a distinction, energy and violence. Energy, the ability to do work. Violence connotes destructive power or force. And the idea is that violence might get you your end, but it destroys a lot of other valued ends, things that are valued by others, things that are sometimes valued by you. And then interestingly enough, you look at the end of this quotation from Dewey, he's telling his class about the policy of passive inaction, right? This is something you want to give up, the idea of just, passive inaction. Now, I believe Dewey is referring, and I have evidence for this, that I think Dewey is referring to Tolstoy, who was an influence on Gandhi. I don't think, so, in the 1918, when Ambedkar is wrestling with non-resistance, he's wrestling with Russell, he's wrestling with Tolstoy, he's wrestling with what Dewey bequeathed him. He's not explicitly yet engaging the Indian versions of these. Interestingly enough, you see the end of this passage as Dewey say something kind of negative about nirvana. Ambedkar probably was excited to hear pragmatism and was probably disappointed to hear Dewey not understand Buddhism as it could be an active faith and engaged faith. But no one's perfect, of course. So here we are. The challenge for Ambedkar's Navayana pragmatism from that year, 1918 onwards, was simple. How do you achieve a social democracy while maintaining the balance between these three values? And violence might get you an equality in bank accounts. Everyone has the same amount of money, but you're going to lose liberty, you're going to lose fraternity. So how do you achieve these things? That's the challenge. Now, theme 3, and I'm getting close to concluding this, is that Navayana Buddhism starts to become a religious means of intelligent democratic reform. So in the 1950s, as we all know, Ambedkar turns more and more towards Buddhism. In late 40s, it seems like he's committed to converting to Buddhism. In the 1950, he writes Buddha and the Future of His Religion, and by 56, he converts at his massive conversion ceremony, and he authors along the way the Buddha and His Gospel in 51, which changes to the Buddha and His Dhamma. So my next book is going to chart the transition from the Buddha and His Gospel to the Buddha and His Dhamma, because it's fascinating. But I'll leave that aside for now. So let's return back again to that book I said was so influential to Ambedkar, Dewey's Democracy and Education. Again, the first copy was a 1916 edition, purchased in 1917 when Ambedkar was in London. And you see the signature down there from the inside cover of it. Now, from my research at Siddharth College, Malind College, private collections, I found at least four copies of Democracy and Education owned by Babasaheb. He loved this book. 4 copies, 2 of them are heavily annotated. Okay, and this is the earliest one, but like in the ones that are annotated, this line is underlined in each of those copies. You see this exact line in Annihilation of Caste. You see this line in other places. But this is Dewey's words: a democracy is more than a form of government. It's primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. This line was incredibly inspirational to Ambedkar. He saw in this what was precisely wrong with caste. It was a way of thinking about other people that destroyed your ability to live in communication with them, in conjunction with them, right? You literally couldn't touch these people, or didn't want to touch things they had touched. And so as caste split up people in communities, and in doing so, it destroys democracy. That's Ambedkar's commitment in Navayana pragmatism. Another book of Dewey's that was incredibly influential to Ambedkar, I found 2 copies of this in Siddharth College's archives that were owned by Ambedkar. It's the 1908 edition of John Dewey and James Hayden Tufts' textbook called Ethics, 1908. They published another version in 1932, which was substantially revised. I've never found any evidence that Ambedkar knew of or read that one. But in both of these 1908 editions, you see, I've circled in this picture, the same section that Ambedkar thought highly enough of to underline it in one of his distinctive styles of annotating. And this is where John Dewey and Tufts talks about principles and rules. Okay, so right here, these are the words again of Dewey in his section of ethics. Rules are practical, they're habitual ways of doing things, but principles are intellectual. They're useful methods of judging things. The examples Dewey gives in here are things like the 10 Commandments are rules. They're very specific and concrete, but they're inflexible. And the golden rule, do unto others as others do unto you, or something like that, that's, Dewey said, that's a principle. That's flexible, helps you with different unpredicted situations. So now you think about that distinction, and Ambedkar definitely did. In 1936, in Annihilation of Caste, what does he accuse Hinduism of being? A religion of rules. And so he says, let's blow up the Shastras, destroy religion, but I don't mean destroy religion per se, destroy religion as a religion of rules. And he leaves open the idea of maybe Hinduism could come back as a religion of principle. He definitely thinks things like Buddhism could be a religion of principle. Okay, so here's where he refers to the same distinction from the ethics that he underlined in the Annihilation of Caste. He uses this as part of his critique of Hinduism. Now, in the 1950s, right, he comes back to this kind of verbiage and he says, look, Buddhism declines in India. This is a shame, but it declines in India because of 3 things. And 2 of those 3 things are repetitions. In the 1956 essay, he says it declined because of a lack of abiding principles in it, a lack of versatile and conquering orators, and a lack of easily understandable principles. So as someone who teaches in a communication department, who also researches philosophy, this fascinates me. He's referring to Dewey's principles as something that Buddhism lacked at a certain historical point, and the orators. He says that religions needs powerful speakers, not Dhamma talks by someone who mumbles on a stage that he saw in Sri Lanka or wherever, and then left. So, you need powerful speakers and you need principles that are flexible. And, obviously he's going to bring these back to Buddhism. Another fascinating thing I've come across is there's a 1948 book on karma, and, that Ambedkar owned. And it's, remarkably unannotated. Probably it's not the most important book in the world. But in the table of contents, in Ambedkar's own hands, I found this utterance scrawled. And this shows you a little bit about what he's thinking when he reads a book. Ambedkar was smart. He had valuable time, he had a value to his time that was beyond ours. So he didn't read just to burn up time. So when he's reading, he's thinking, he's saying, how can I use this stuff? And some things he stopped reading, because they were not promising value. This book is intriguing. He didn't find it very valuable to underline, but it was valuable insofar as the general concept of the book brought this question to mind. As he says in his handwriting in the table of contents, what place has will and effort in the laws of karma? So what role do will and effort have? So karma, of course, gets changed in the 1950s by him, but he's concerned with views of Buddhism or Hinduism or any religion that take the individual out of the equation, that encourage fatalism, that encourage determinism, that encourage you to think you can just make a simple change and you're safe in the next life. He wanted something that engaged us in the battle of life and justice. So he's concerned with concepts like karma that either increase or decrease, this sort of thing. So if you look to 1956, October 14th, in that wonderful field in Nagpur, which now has Diksha Bhumi on it. I've been there. It's very inspirational. You think about what he was doing and the meaning of it. Okay, he comes up with 22 vows, and he administered. These are administered to him. He then administers them to 300 to 600,000 people in the audience who then become Buddhists. And you start to look at the content of these vows, and you can start to see how some of them are rules. They say, don't do this specific thing. But some of them, many of them, perhaps the most important of them, are what you could call principles. I shall believe in the equality of mankind. That doesn't tell you exactly how to treat someone you talk to on Facebook. You have to figure it out. You have to apply this principle, think through it, maybe think in their shoes, maybe think about what's going wrong in the interaction. These are principles that help you engage the tough reality of life instead of just say, up here in the heavens, that's the answer to how you should always behave in every situation. So you see here, there's a variety of ones that I would class as Deweyan principles. Like strive to be compassionate to all living beings and nurture them. It's unclear exactly how every time you will nurture or act to be compassionate, but the idea, the principle is the same. Try to figure out the most compassionate way to this being in this situation and go forward. So, you start to think that what he was doing in Nagpur was fascinating, and it's absolutely unique to my reading in the history of philosophy. We have a lot of philosophers who think big thoughts. We have a lot of religious figures, activists who do great things. But there are rare moments where those two strands, your philosophy and what you do with your own body, come into unison. And so Ambedkar's philosophy talks about things like willfulness, effort, reclaiming dignity through your own actions, being a powerful orator and speaker. And what is he doing out there on the field of Nagpur? He is putting this doctrine into a ritualized form. So he is being that willful person who's taking control of the respect he is due. So I find that very moving. I find that very unique. I find that a creative act that's not there in Kant. Immanuel Kant, I love him. But, he had a wonderful theory of ethics. But, there's no moment where Kant has a theory of ethics and it all comes down to one 20-minute Diksha ceremony. So, Ambedkar's life and Ambedkar's thought combine at so many moments, and Nagpur is, I think, the culmination of that whole life and that whole philosophy, and it's pragmatism. So let's look, I'll conclude on this point, but let's look at his notion of ahimsa. So, of course, you've heard of ahimsa. Ahimsa is typically non-harm, non-violence, but in the Buddha and his Dhamma, not in the Buddha and his gospel, but in the Buddha and his Dhamma, he has a section where he starts to rework ahimsa. And I give you some of the highlighted portions here, but, he says the question's been raised about Buddha's ahimsas, whether it's absolute or relative. And then he refers to something you will now recognize as part of Ambedkar's pragmatist lineage. Was it only a principle, Ambedkar writes, or was it a rule? Okay, and so he then goes on and explains the notion of ahimsa as a principle. Love all so that you may not wish to kill any. This is a positive way of stating the principle of ahimsa. And then he says, to make it clear, he gives the opposite, side to this. He says, ahimsa does not say kill not. It says love all. So, in this revised version of the Buddha and his gospel, you start to see him being explicit about this. And he says, to put differently, the Buddha made a distinction between principle and rule. He did not make ahimsa a matter of a rule. He enunciated as a matter of a principle or a way of life. And a principle leaves you the freedom to act. A rule does not. And then Ambedkar gives this wonderful way of putting the Deweyan distinction. Rule either breaks you or you break the rule. It's very harsh, very concrete. A principle can live up to the complexity of life. So you start to see here that Navayana Buddhism, the form of which is explicated in the Buddha and his Dhamma, is a religion of principle. This is what he said we needed in 1936. The annihilation of caste. You need a religion of principle, not a religion of rules. And why do you need this? Because it's full of things like ahimsa that are useful to reconstruct your habits of communicating and interacting with other people in an uncertain world. And these are also key to balancing, striking the tough balance between liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, how do you do this? There's no one way to do this, and there's no forceful way that one person can just make the world better. It's going to be a path that's filled with persuasive activity. You're going to have to talk to people. You're going to convince people. You have to do what Ambedkar was trying to do his whole life. Make all sorts of different changes, but bring people into community. So his Buddhism, in many ways in the 1950s, was his new vision of democracy, but it was, of a piece with the old vision of democracy. So in the 1950s, he authored a manuscript, a very partial manuscript. We don't have the whole thing, but it's, he talks about communism related to Buddhism. Now Dewey had many reservations about Marxism and communism. Dewey and Ambedkar probably could be classed as socialists in terms of economic and political views, but they, I think you can clearly see why they were not communists, given that view of their time. And the thing that bugged Ambedkar about it, he puts in this manuscript. He says, well, the Russian Revolution was important, but in producing an equal society, you cannot afford to sacrifice fraternity and liberty. And he thinks that the violence of the Russian Revolution, the violence he had seen in Hungary and other countries in the 1950s, these things were achieving some goal, but destroying other things, namely destroying liberty, namely destroying fraternal commonness among people, the love of each other. And Ambedkar famously says, it seems that the three values can only exist together if one follows the way of the Buddha. Communism, Ambedkar says, can give one, but cannot give all. So you see this in other parts of the manuscript, but he says Buddha's method of getting all of these things was different. It was persuasion. It was to alter other people's mindsets without the use of force, so that they voluntarily agreed to do what you have been talking to them about. So he says this is going to be tough. This is going to involve the constant preaching of the Dhamma. I think he believed it also meant you're going to fail sometimes. Democracy is about learning how to win and learning how to lose in concert with your fellow citizens. So Ambedkar in the 1950s starts giving this beautiful image of Buddhism, of democracy, and I suggest to you his philosophy of pragmatism that involves the tough and sometimes tragic pursuit of democracy. And in the Buddha and his Dhamma, I'll return and end on this point. The Buddha and his Dhamma is a complex work, a fascinating work. In many ways, it was aspirational. Ambedkar, the politician, often didn't live up to the values of Buddha and his Dhamma, but this is probably not many people live up to the values of Buddhism, but you try. This is the aspirational nature of it. And in that book, he says this, and it constantly impresses me at the end of his life, how he saw the quest for human community in these very concrete personal terms. And he advises people through the mouth of the Buddha that we should cherish no anger, forget your enmities, win your enemies by love. This is the Buddhist way of life. So this is very powerful rhetoric in his last years. don't win your cause or achieve justice by beating down your enemies or depriving them of power or killing them even. He says at one point the communists are kind of successful because if you kill people, they're not there to resist you in the next case. But Ambedkar was enough of a Democrat, enough of a pragmatist, enough of a believer in democracy to realize that you had to make community with your enemies just like you had to make a community with your friends. And there are better and worse ways to make a community with those you disagree with. So in conclusion, if you start zooming out and asking in general, what's this Stroud guy saying about Buddhism and social democracy? This is kind of how I would start to summarize that. Social democracy seems to be about creating a community animated by shared interests and respectful individuals. Okay. And that, to get this, you can't destroy communal bonds and create animosity and hatred because, this kind of stuff may get you something tomorrow, but it won't get you that community in a month. It won't get you that community in a year or two. It just creates enemies that are going to find a new way to outdo you next time. So, this is the challenge. You must find ways to nurture that basis to community and accept the limits to our will and power. So willfulness and effort is key, but Ambedkar is enough of a pragmatist to realize you can't do everything. You can't do everything. You can't do it now. So here's how I would summarize Ambedkar's pragmatist Navayana Buddhism. One, it's a socially engaged philosophy. Okay, suffering is, mental dissatisfaction, but it's also for Ambedkar material things like poverty that we have to address, we have to solve, we have to, reflect on. It focuses on problematic habits and attitudes of self and others. So his view of Buddhism is engaged, but it's not just a matter of bank accounts or of how much food's on table or about jobs. It's not that form of, let's say, Marxist Buddhism. It's very much, if you had a lot of money, you could still have the kind of habits that destroy community with others and degrade your experience of self. So habits and attitudes are absolutely vital. Three, one of the ways to deal with this is by using principles. Okay, now principles are an individual thing. We don't think as a community usually. We think as individuals for much of our experienced life. So how do we engage others? How do we value them? How do we disrespect them? So principles are one of those rays of hope in Ambedkar that can give us a way to usefully create community with our neighbor, with everyone. Ahimsa, 4, becomes one of Ambedkar's best principles. Right? I think ahimsa is overlooked in Ambedkar. Everyone thinks of nonviolence and Gandhi, but it's a important concept in Ambedkar. The only reason we miss it is because we don't think of Ambedkar often enough as a Buddhist, or we think of ahimsa as nonviolence and we miss Ambedkar's rereading of it. It's very much the same thing Dewey was talking about with democratic community as a way of conjoint experience with others. Ambedkar just translates this into ahimsa, adds onto it concerns of fraternity. And then 5th, how do we get this is difficult. There is no easy way. There is no way to say if we get enough guns, we can achieve something lasting. Ambedkar largely gives up on violence. And I think I very much respect that about him. Dewey also, did not think much at the end of his life about violence being a very useful means. Tended to destroy more than it gained or created. So Ambedkar at the end of his life, very much thinks that organizing and persuasion, the constant preaching of the Dhamma, changing people's minds, these are the methods of the Buddha. These are the methods of Ambedkar, not violence and coercion. I think he was also resigned at the end of his life that no one would push the caravan to its conclusion. Maybe there is no conclusion, but as long as we push things forward, this is all we can ask. So there's a tragic sense of Ambedkar. You cannot solve everything. Buddhism cannot make everything perfect, but maybe some of these religious principles can make things a little better. So I'll end there. And like I said, a lot of these answers or a lot of my speculations are going to be in the book, but it continues to fascinate me, the relationship of Ambedkar and pragmatism. And there's so much more to this story to tell. So I welcome your questions and discussions. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Scott. It was a wonderful talk. Actually, I really impressed that you have worked so much to bring all these connections of pragmatism, Ambedkar and Buddhism and how the interpretation you have done, it was amazing. It must have been a really, really hard work. Thank you for sharing all
thank
the
you.
information. Yeah, thank you. Really, really appreciate. So let's open the question and answer session. Please raise your hands if you have any questions, and we will address the questions in the order. So I see two hands. So I would like to ask Sidnath, please go ahead, unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Hi, Professor Scott. Wonderful lecture. I mean, gives a very, academic ways of understanding pragmatism, Ambedkar, and Buddhism. And, you linked those three things very beautifully. So my question is basically, what role context or societal context, plays in building pragmatism? For instance, Indian society is highly unequal. I mean, caste, gender, patriarchy, everything is there. And in order to, apply pragmatism, how do we, manage that, or how do we understand that context and pragmatism, and linking them together?
Yes, Sinag, this is a wonderful question, and something I continue to think about, because in many ways, I've always been into democracy in America. And, I've been, long ago, I was interested in Vedanta, let's say, in Indian tradition. So I knew about India, but, this project has, over the last 6 or so years, I've been engaged with Ambedkar. It's really shown me that the challenges India faces, a lot of them are specific to India, but some of them aren't. And India, in many ways, is going down the democratic road, the road of democracy, that America is battling with. And so this is, I think, one of those points that probably drew Ambedkar closer to Dewey. Even though America was dealing with race and racism, and India was dealing with casteism or communal conflict between religions, there were different specific, problems in the countries. They were still dealing with the overall democratic problem, which is, how do you create a community among individuals and groups that don't always get along and don't always agree, and put it more pointedly, vociferously hate each other, hate the way those people think. And religion, of course, brings out the best of us. Sometimes religion brings out the worst of us. So this is, think about this as kind of the setting, and Dewey's wrestling with people like Walter Lippmann about how do you get people in Rhode Island to care about people in Texas, or to care about the same things? Is it even possible? So Dewey is kind of perplexed by the democratic experiment. Ambedkar is forced into the democratic experiment, and I think he becomes a partisan of it, because he writes the Constitution of the world's largest democracy. So I think he's very much invested in going down this road. And so this is something I've been impressed by when I'm thinking about these two thinkers. There are so many differences. I've got a side project that I'm going to write on, which is what Dewey knew of India. And it turns out Dewey knew a little bit about India. He didn't seem to know a lot about what Ambedkar was doing, but that's Dewey's problem. If my student wrote the world's largest democracy's constitution, I would send him an email. Good job. So anyway, he knew very little about Buddhism. Dewey's understanding of Buddhism was very skewed. So these are some of those questions I have. So even though Dewey had a not perfect view of India, they both, both he and Ambedkar had similarities enough on democracy. Was this even possible to make this kind of dream a reality? So it's just fascinating to think about the many differences. Thank you, Siddhant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siddhant. So I would like to ask Vikas, please go ahead, ask your question. Unmute yourself, please. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Scott. It's wonderful listening you. It's my second time. I heard you in Nagpur, first time in person, when you were in Dr. Nitin Raut's lecture series, Buddhism lecture series. And yeah, I heard your presentation, and this is second time. And I'm also like a student of Columbia University, and doing masters in comparative and international education and in teachers college. And it's very fascinating to me, because I also wanted to see like what is the relation between these two philosophers like John Dewey and Dr. Ambedkar. And I was like when I entered here, I just gathered all the books written by John Dewey, and I was like started reading, but I can't see like what concepts and what things Ambedkar took from John Dewey. And as you very specifically gathered all this and relate and make it very compact, very brief, and very specific. So I loved your presentation, and it will help me to like understand like which part of John Dewey's Ambedkar took and like implemented in his whole life. So my question is here like so first question is very practical, like student like me. So after doing your research, so reading your research is the one part of like doing engaging with, but what another things you wanted to like student what your what you say, what you think like researcher can do, like if I am in the space of Columbia right now, so what should be my role, and which what what needs to be done like by researchers, like coming from his community and coming and looking his research. Hope you
Yeah,
got my point. I confused it.
Yeah, well, of course, and because I'll be absolutely disappointing because I can't give you an assignment. Yeah, you got to find. I think the best thing is like you're obviously concerned about what researchers can do that impacts the world of justice and injustice. So perhaps you're interested in the problem of caste. And so, yeah, this is one fascinating thing is how do you translate our research on Ambedkar into the battle against caste? And there are a lot of wonderful organizations, the Ambedkar International Center, Ambedkar International Mission, Ambedkarite Association of North America, that are fighting, on the ground battles against caste oppression. And, I get involved in those a little bit, but some people have to get involved in those a lot. So, I mean, if that's your calling, go for it. In terms of research, though, my method has been, what kind of questions do I have about Babasaheb that I don't see anyone answering? Now, these could be not answered because they're boring questions or not useful. So at any rate, but that's what spawned my book. Was just no one was giving me the information on more about Dewey and Ambedkar. Now, there are other ways Mirananda has a wonderful book called Prophets Facing Backwards. I encourage anyone to go get a copy of that. And, she has a chapter called The Deweyan Buddha. This is from the 90s. And it's a wonderful book because she holds up Ambedkar's philosophy of Buddhism next to Dewey's philosophy of religion. And this is very, insightful, I think. It shows you the compatibility between these two thinkers on how they use religion. The thing I found, unsatisfying from one perspective is that there was no evidence, and I still have not been able to find evidence, that Ambedkar read these religious works of Dewey's. A Common Faith is one of the Dewey books. If you want to know what Dewey thought on religion, it's a very short book, read that. But Dewey, I don't think Ambedkar ever knew of the existence of that book. So historically, there wasn't a big story to tell on Dewey's view of religion and Ambedkar's view of religion. Conceptually, you can put these two together and tell a story. So that's another lesson I've gained a new appreciation for, Vikas, is that there's going to be a variety of ways of using the Ambedkar-Dewey relationship. One's going to be historical and maybe boring like my way. There's probably other ways, maybe even ways that connect to more activism. But I just encourage you and others to find your path and don't think that you have to do everything. I think this is a disabling response. My research has to change the everything about the world. No, we all push the caravan forward, if but a foot or two. That's, I think, what Babasaheb would support.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Scott. That was a very, very simple and insightful answer. Just pull the caravan. I like that.
Yeah.
Next question we have, Mr. Satynath. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Professor. Jai Bhim and Namo Buddhaya. It was very enlightening and it's insightful to hear you. But I have two-part questions. One is with regard to democracy. You mentioned the word social democracy. Is that any different from just plain the word democracy? as well as from political democracy. I mean, do you have any distinction between all these three?
Yes, sir, that's a great question. And I think that's one thing I kind of left out of this talk. But yeah, definitely Ambedkar and Dewey were believers in a wider notion of democracy. So like a lot of academics, a lot of the discourse in the US right now, when they talk about democracy is at risk, and then they're talking about voting rights or corruption or faked ballots or whatever they talk about. Notice what the standard approach is democracy is a matter of decision making, like votes or who we vote for to vote for policies in Delhi or Washington. So Ambedkar and Dewey, though, come at it the other way, which is like democracy is a way of relating to other people. And then you have a version of that in Washington or Delhi or in your factory. But, it's primarily a social, construction of life. And so that's why, Dewey talks about democracy as a way of life. And Ambedkar talks about, political democracy. We may have political democracy, but not social democracy. He makes these distinctions. Other places he talks about economic democracy. I'll leave that to the side. But that social democracy, I think, is absolutely key because it's something that goes beyond any given government structure. I think that's the important thing. Any kind of group of people, there are going to be more democratic ways that they interact with each other. There's going to be less. So caste, for instance, is a less democratic way of structuring a grouping of people. It separates them. It ranks them in hierarchy and value. It encourages some to connect, but not everyone. So I think that's how I would describe it quickly, is that social democracy isn't it's not about government. It's about how you and I and you and us interact.
Okay. It raises many other questions in my mind, but I'll move on to the second question that I had. In Annihilation of Castes, that title itself was not something chosen by him. It was this group of people, who were organized around Jat Pat Todo. In English, that means basically annihilate castes. And they had invited him for presidential, declared him that he would be the president of that particular annual gathering. And so he prepared his lecture, and the title he gave was Annihilation of Caste. But I don't think, I have read the book. The whole book mostly dwells upon as criticism of Hindu religion. He thinks it's absurd to think of annihilation of caste without annihilating Hindu religion as such. So, because I feel annihilation of caste essentially is going to be undertaken by the right-wing people by forcing everybody to use use last names that are indicative of that does not identify your caste. Many people already do that, like use Kumar, Prasad, or something, or their purpose is basically to eradicate any kind of what we call quota system in India, but affirmative action basically. And in many ways, identifying caste is important because different castes have suffered different amount of discrimination. And if we need to equalize everybody, we can't just say that, okay, the rules are same for everybody. Now you write a answer to these questions and you'll be graded on that. And the ones who come up to the top will be selected for some position of power or higher education or whatever. So that's not equality to my mind. I think equality requires taking the discrimination against different groups of people into account and do something about it to equalize them all. So I would like you to make your comments about what I said.
No, yeah, and what you said was very complex and a lot of issues brought in. And India's today challenge with caste still exists, kind of like America and racism. And it's so every once in a while someone comes along and says, let's just quit talking about caste. Let's just quit talking about race, and then it'll be solved. And at the Ambedkarite position, going back to annihilation of caste, kind of shows you why that's unrealistic. Why? Because these aren't just the use of a word. It's the attitude that structures your view of the world that makes that word important. And so caste is a notion, it's a state of mind. And so same for race. So, obviously curtailing certain external behaviors like discrimination are part of the solution, but they're not the whole solution. And, giving up on talking about it is not really the solution. So yeah, this is a challenging debate. And I, by no means in my book or wherever, I'm not engaging in the what should India do about reservations debate now. There are a lot of people that know a lot more about this than I do. The main thing I would point your attention to at the beginning of your comments, sir, you said, Ambedkar thought you had to destroy Hinduism as such, I believe is how you said it. And, it depends on what we mean by as such. And remember in that text, he says, look, people get upset at what I say. It's almost like he anticipated the 22 members of the Mandal, because this was a friendly audience. This is something that perplexes me about annihilation of caste. These were upper caste reformers who didn't like the caste system. So they were friendly. They were still upper caste Hindus, but they were friendly to his cause. And so it's a very jarring message for those types. But nonetheless, he clarifies it in there. He says, we want to get rid of Hinduism as a religion of rules, but we're not going to destroy religion, implying Hinduism as principles. And later on in that book, right, this book is fascinating because he doesn't advocate Buddhism, but on the cover of the first edition and the other editions, he has a quotation from Buddha about no truth is truth and untruth is untruth. And in the text of the speech, right, he doesn't propose Buddha. He says, maybe you can find a religion, a principle in Guru Nanak's, Sikhism, or the Upanishads. And this is one of those rare moments where Ambedkar praises something about the Sanskrit tradition. Another spot I found is in the Buddha, Brahma is not Dharma, the chapter in Riddles in Hinduism. There he praises effectively, Brahmaism, he calls it, which, would be like a form of Vedanta. So there are these moments where he says there's potentials within Hinduism to be a religion of principle. So I don't think I'd go as far as saying he wants to destroy Hinduism, but this is, again, it's a tough thing because in many cases, Ambedkar was incredibly harsh to Hindus of his day in his rhetoric, right? And that's one thing that fascinates me. At the end of his life, he leaves the world with 2 unpublished texts, Buddha and his Dhamma, which gets published, Love Your Enemies, Riddles in Hinduism, which takes until 87 for it to get published by the Maharashtra government. Riddles in Hinduism was incredibly harsh to many of the Hindus of his day. So he's a man of contradictions. He's a man of complexities, but aren't we all, full of complexities and contradictions? But yeah, thank you for your thoughts. Very thought provoking. I'll keep thinking about this stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Satyanathji. Jagmohanji, please go ahead. Jagannathanji, sorry. Please go ahead. Ask your question.
Professor Scott, many thanks. My question is not beating around the bush, very simple and straightforward. See, 1957 and that period, the great contributions of Ambedkar have been cited so well. I found science and conscience at its best. Coming back to the question, see, today, how we make Ambedkar relevant is my question. my simple observation is, so what next? This is my question myself. So coming back to this, in America, for example, right to repair a bill is pending in Senate. It will simply throw away the throwaway culture. You see, if right to repair law is enacted in America, it will have a lot of implication on this throwaway culture, which runs to trillions of dollars of technological things like simple mobile, electronic gadgets, things like that. So my question is very simple. Why Ambedkarites in America or elsewhere are not looking at the current issues? See, it is as an enlightenment. Al Gore, the former vice president, he's telling every third American is affected by climate change. Why George Bush had no money in 1992 for climate change. And Trump goes on to his knees for Angela, where a volcano not to hurt Americans. So the present day problems are haunting. See, when I was in America for the 6th Planetary Defense Conference, Maryland University, all the Black Americans whom I met were so much disgusted because health was not a public good. Health was not a public good. I'm now a World Health Organization infodemic manager. See, unless health is a public good that is free for all everywhere, we are not going to do anything. Already $5 trillion have been eaten away by pandemic out of 25 trillion. So my question is very simple. Why Ambedkarites today are not bothered to give rich tributes to a great man called Jai Bhim, who gave the science and conscience to our realization? I need a simple answer. It may be a very tough question, but I need to interact with you more. The paucity of time, I would like to have more networking with you. Question is very simple. Why the present day critical issues are not a part of Ambedkarites' thinking of the present day? Always staying in the past. See, I was born in 1957. People are telling me about those 1957. I'm 65 by now. I need to leave behind some legacy, but I don't have that indications being coming up. I'm sorry for being a bit critical, but I thought it should be addressed. Thank you very much.
That's good. So that's great, sir. And I mean, yeah, that's one of the challenges. Like when I go to conferences on Ambedkar, it's wonderful because everyone loves Ambedkar. But yeah, oftentimes, we need to criticize the arguments. Ambedkar was not right on everything. He even says this so much, right? If my interpretation of Buddhism is wrong, tell me. And so yeah, he was open to reason and argument. So this is wonderful. Your question is simple, but incredibly hard to answer. Why, here's, I think, the dynamic, right? Here's the dynamic is that, Ambedkarites and scholars that are trying to get Ambedkar into the discussions in America, this is a battle of recognition, right? It's, so not even just caste, doing battle of caste, but it's recognizing a thinker or a tradition or a group, Dalit thought, as worthy of inclusion. Okay, so it's a battle of recognition. So, and I sense this in my writings. A lot of people are like, well, who's Ambedkar? They can't even say his name. They don't even bother to learn it. So, part of my challenge is that all my Western friends who know Dewey, I want them to know Ambedkar. And so I'm lucky because I can use Dewey to kind of shoehorn in Ambedkar. So they know Gandhi. They don't read any Gandhi, but they need to know about Ambedkar and hopefully read Ambedkar. Now, there are larger issues, like you said. People in America, Dalits and Ambedkarites in America are forcing caste into the discussions in America. This is great. Maybe they're going to get involved in the climate change debates, like you say. The challenge with that, I sense, is that it dilutes the battle for recognition. The more you have a Ambedkarite view on climate change, it might be indistinguishable from, I don't know, some environmentalist group on climate change. Ambedkar falls out of that. So you might gain everything in life, you gain things, everything in life, you lose things. So if you focus on the battle for recognition, like I am, you lose non-Ambedkar related things. Like what I've been talking about, it's focused on caste, on dusty texts, but I'm not talking about the right to repair. I have an iPhone I can't get into here myself. So, this is the challenge, right? So if you go to these wider issues, you're going to lose some of the focus and value and halo on Ambedkar. So that's up to various people to decide. everyone can pursue different paths. I'm a pragmatist, so I'm going to chip away at my history stuff. You, sir, can make Ambedkar part of the framework for engaging climate change, let's say, and hopefully people join you. And this will be an important kind of addition to that debate. So I think this is one interesting and pragmatist way to kind of view the very simple but difficult question you asked.
Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very
Thank you,
convincing.
Jagannath-ji.
Thank you.
We have a last, I think, one more question. Mr. Meshram, please go ahead. Ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Scott. First of all, I'll be looking forward to your book. Whatever you mentioned that you are thinking about writing and covering really got me very excited about it. My question is related to a few things that my observation kind of falls in. In Indian democracy, in our preamble, we have this word called fraternity, which I see not being used or not being seen in Western democracies. Equality, justice, those things are kind of prevalent there. They are part of the basic principles, but the fraternity word is not there. So this fraternity as a principle of life, and again, I'm trying to connect it with Buddhism, where Buddha has metta. You kind of touched upon it when you were talking about ahimsa, and you said ahimsa is metta, basically, not just not killing, but non-violence, but it's metta. But there are two other Brahma Viharas, if you are familiar with those terms from Buddhism. Along with metta, there is mudita and karuna. Karuna becomes compassion, and mudita becomes sympathetic joy in others' good achievements. Fraternity sort of kind of coming and touching upon those two other things coming into being. Do you see that the problems we see in Western democracies or even in India is that the fraternity principle is not being applied at all? That is where the social democracy structure doesn't come into play. All you see is when they talk about democracy is more like a political democracy. Even in US, the talk of democracy, the danger to democracy, all those things are kind of talked in terms of political democracy. Your comments, please, sir.
Yeah, you got to the heart of the issue, I think, which is Buddhism has a long tradition and a great conceptual repertoire of talking about love, maitri, fellowship, fraternity. And in many ways, political thought in the West is impoverished in this regard. We focus on institutions, on justice, on punishing those who deserve to be punished, but this love stuff barely makes an appearance. Rousseau talks about some of it, but it kind of fades out. So yeah, one thing I'll mention to you, sir, is that there's some people in the Western non-Ambedkarite circles that are engaged with this. So pragmatism has people that are pushing for this, because Dewey talks about community. And so this is, getting at some of these same issues that Buddhism has a much better vocabulary for. Some of my colleagues at the center I'm involved in, if anyone follows me on Twitter, they'll see me post pictures of Ambedkar, which is wonderful. But then I'll share stuff from a center at UT Austin called the Center for Media Engagement. But one thing we're trying to do in that center, we focus around a concept called connective democracy. The idea of, look, we have all these social media connections and, all this stuff that we could talk to people across the US or harass them across the US or send hateful tweets at politicians I don't know in person. How do we leverage all those connections to make it more supportive in the way that someone like John Dewey thought a community should be supportive? Even when you don't agree with someone else, you still see each other as citizens, parts of this community. Whereas in the US, probably in India as well, we're very good at saying, I hate those people, or our community would be so much better if those people were not part of it. That's, as Dewey would say, treason to the democratic way of life. And I think Ambedkar would agree. We have to find ways to get friends and enemies in community with us. Even if we absolutely hate what they're thinking or how they think, we have to respect them as community members. So Buddhism, as you say, sir, has a great, vocab for this. Ambedkar's struggle, which is incomplete, we have to keep doing it, is how do you convert vocabularies like metta, maitri, karuna, all this stuff to the political vocabulary of how we deal with caste reform and people who oppose it, right? The Hindu Code Bill was a big disappointment for Ambedkar. So he's wrestling with these issues like we wrestle with. How do you form community with people you're inclined not to agree with or even care for, right? But this is an unanswered question, sir. I'm still working on it myself.
Thank you very much for your comments, sir.
Thank you, Jai Bhim.
Thank you, Pankaj Mishra. We have one more question. Mr. Aule, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Dr. Stroud, for taking us into this amazing and unique journey of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar with Professor Divi. So, and also thanks for letting us know like the words liberty, fraternity, and equality came from a few of his lectures and writings of Dr. Divi. So I heard your one comment like you in the first slide. I remember like you commented like these parameters are successful for India, but US is kind of struggling on these parameters. So I just want your elaborate brief comment on this. I think you might have already addressed this in your upcoming book, but I just want a brief comment of yours.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult issue, and so you're asking about the relationship between Buddhism and democracy, effectively, sir, or?
No, sir. Actually, you mentioned like these parameters of democracy, like equality, fraternity, and liberty. They are successful in India, but US is kind of struggling in these parameters.
Yeah, and okay. I now see the direction you're going with this, but yeah, the context, how much they overlap, how much they're different between the American pragmatists and folks that are in India believing Buddhism like Ambedkar. And yeah, I don't go into it that much in my book. That doesn't mean someone else can't tell that story, but yeah, like what I said here, I love talks like this because you all ask me questions that I say I should have written another 10,000 words in my book. But definitely the context that Dewey was in was saturated with, issues of racial injustice. Dewey was one of the, 20 or so co-founders of the NAACP, fighting against anti-Black racism and such. So, so he wasn't involved in the battle against caste, but he's involved in a similar battle, and so Ambedkar, unlike Dewey, did often draw connections between racism and casteism. So yeah, there's these fascinating overlaps, and there's these fascinating moments where Ambedkar can reflect more on these contexts than even Dewey can, because Dewey in many ways was kind of blind to what's going on in India. I don't know, but this would be fascinating for someone else to write a book on. I can't write all of this, but and I won't do it as well as other people. But yeah, the kind of context of these two great thinkers, how much those contexts contribute to what they do.
Okay, I got your point, but my question again, let me reframe the parameters of democracy, like liberty, fraternity, and justice. They are incorporated in US Constitution as well as in India, right? As well as in Indian Constitution. So
maybe they aren't explicitly listed in the US Constitution.
Yes. So I just wanted to know, like, how do you thought, like, why is it unsuccessful for US in this current situation?
Yeah, well, I think, for instance, in the US, it's a lot easier to guarantee legal equality than to legally create or enforce fraternity, right? And this is the same for the Indian circumstance, right? You can have in the preamble that we're going to have the dignity of all and fraternity, but there's nothing in the Indian Constitution that makes people think of others as dignified or worthy of respect. Okay, so this is a classic problem. It's in the West. How do you legislate issues of attitude? It's incredibly hard. Now Dewey, in his lectures to Ambedkar, and his class, kind of said, well, there's a dialectic Laws create behaviors which influence the thoughts. And so there, sometimes you can make everyone treat each other externally equally, and it'll seep into their habits of how they look at each other. So if you have laws that forbid racist practices, this could to some extent strike a blow against the mental notions that underlie racism. So there's this dialectic that you might be able to leverage, but I mean, the fraternity bit is incredibly hard. How do you create a community of people that love and respect each other? I don't think anyone, Dewey, America, India, Ambedkar has the solution for that. But I think people like Ambedkar see the challenge. A lot of people don't even see the challenge. Create a just society in terms of laws and equality. You still have this part to the puzzle missing. How do you make people respect each other?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
thank you so much.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Thank you, sir. Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali.